The snow fell like frozen accusations that December night, covering the stone steps of St. Agnes Convent in a blanket of white silence. Sister Margaret stood behind the heavy oak door, her hand trembling on the iron handle as the desperate knocking echoed through the empty corridor. Outside, a woman's voice cut through the wind, begging for mercy, pleading for warmth. But the nun did not open. She did not move. She simply closed her eyes and whispered a prayer that tasted like ash in her mouth. What Sister Margaret would discover in the coming days would not just change her life. It would shatter everything she believed about grace, redemption, and the very nature of divine purpose. Sister Margaret had spent 23 years behind those convent walls, a life measured in morning prayers and evening vespers, in silence and obedience. She was 51 years old, her face marked by discipline rather than age, her hands calloused from decades of scrubbing floors and tending gardens. The other sisters called her the Stone Pillar, a woman who never wavered, never questioned, never broke the sacred rules that governed their cloistered existence. But on that frozen evening, when the desperate mother collapsed on those steps, something inside Margaret cracked, a fissure so small she barely noticed it. Yet from that tiny crack, an entire cathedral of doubt would eventually crumble. The knocking had started just after evening prayers, urgent and desperate, like a dying heartbeat against wood. Sister Margaret had been walking the corridor when she heard it, her rosary beads clicking softly in the darkness. Mother Superior's voice echoed in her memory, stern and absolute. "We do not open our doors after Vespers. The world outside is chaos. We are sanctuaries of order." These words had been her compass for more than 2 decades. Rules were not suggestions. They were sacred architecture, the very bones that held their holy life together. She approached the door slowly, each step a negotiation with her conscience. Through the small window, she could see the woman outside. Young, perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to her face by melting snow. In her arms, wrapped in what looked like a torn blanket, something small moved. A child. The woman's lips were blue, her entire body shaking so violently that even through the thick door Margaret could sense the violence of that cold. "Please," the woman cried out, her voice breaking like ice. "My daughter. She is burning with fever. I just need one night, just warmth. Please, in the name of God." Sister Margaret's hand hovered over the lock. For a moment, everything hung suspended. The sacred rule, the suffering outside, the warmth inside, the cruel mathematics of mercy. And then, as if her body acted without permission from her soul, she stepped back. She did not open the door. She turned away, her habit rustling like judgment in the silence, and walked back down the corridor. Behind her, the knocking continued, growing weaker, more desperate, until finally it stopped altogether. The silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, Sister Margaret knelt in the chapel and prayed for forgiveness, even as she wondered what exactly she was asking to be forgiven for. The next morning arrived with brutal sunlight reflecting off fresh snow, turning the world into a blinding white page. Sister Margaret woke before dawn, as she always did, but something felt different. The air tasted wrong. Her prayers felt like empty syllables. When she walked to the chapel for morning mass, her footsteps echoed with a hollowness she had never noticed before. During breakfast, eaten in silence as their rule demanded, she could not swallow the bread. It lodged in her throat like an accusation. After morning duties, she found herself drawn to the front entrance. She told herself she was simply checking for damage from the storm, but when she opened the heavy door, her breath caught. There on the top step, partially covered by new snow, lay a small bundle. Sister Margaret descended slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knelt, her habit soaking through from the wet stone, and pulled back the frozen fabric. A child's face stared up at her, eyes closed, lips the color of winter sky. The little girl could not have been more than 3 years old. For several seconds, Sister Margaret could not move, could not breathe, could not think. She reached out with shaking fingers and touched the child's neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. The skin was cold as marble, and beside the child, barely visible beneath the snow, a piece of paper. Margaret pulled it free, her hands trembling so badly the words blurred, but she forced herself to read. Her name was Sophie. She loved stories about birds. She laughed when it rained. Please forgive me for leaving her. Please forgive me for everything. Tell her that her mother loved her more than breath itself. The paper fell from Margaret's hands. She gathered the small body into her arms, this frozen child who would never hear another story, never laugh at rain again, and carried her inside. The weight was almost nothing, light as sin, heavy as damnation. The convent erupted in controlled chaos. Mother Superior was summoned. The local priest arrived, his face grave. Police were called. Through it all, Sister Margaret sat in the chapel, still as stone, staring at the crucifix above the altar. The other sisters whispered around her, their voices a chorus of shock and sorrow, but Margaret heard none of it. She was lost in a memory that played over and over. The knocking, the woman's voice, the moment she turned away. The police detective was a weathered man named Caldwell, with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. He questioned Margaret gently, his notebook open on his lap. "Can you describe the woman who came to the door?" "Dark hair," Margaret heard herself say. "Young, maybe 25. She had a child in her arms. She was asking for shelter, and you did not let her in." It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. Margaret closed her eyes. "We have rules. After evening prayers, the doors remain locked, for our safety, for the preservation of our sacred space." Detective Caldwell wrote something down, his pen scratching against paper like tiny claws. "Did the woman say anything else? Any name? Where she was from?" "She said her daughter was sick, burning with fever. She begged in the name of God." Margaret's voice cracked on those last words. The detective looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, Margaret saw something that cut deeper than any accusation. She saw pity. The investigation moved quickly. Within 2 days, they found the mother. Her body was discovered 3 blocks from the convent, curled beneath a highway overpass, frozen solid. Her identification revealed her name was Diana Orozco, 26 years old, last known address a homeless shelter on the east side that had closed down 6 months prior. She had no family, no emergency contacts, no one to claim her body except the city morgue. The medical examiner's report stated that Diana had died from severe hypothermia, likely within 2 hours of leaving the convent steps. The child, Sophie, had succumbed to pneumonia complicated by exposure. Both deaths, the report concluded, were tragically preventable. Those last 2 words haunted Sister Margaret like a ghost she could not exorcise. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Local reporters descended on St. Agnes Convent, their cameras and questions battering against the sanctuary walls. Headlines screamed across newspapers and websites. "Nun refuses dying mother and child." Religious orders questioned after tragic deaths. Church values under scrutiny. The Archdiocese issued a carefully worded statement expressing deep sorrow while defending the right of religious communities to maintain their protocols. But inside the convent, something fundamental had shifted. The other sisters looked at Margaret differently now, some with sympathy, others with something harder to name. Mother Superior called her to the office on the 3rd day after the discovery. The older woman sat behind her desk, hands folded, her face an impenetrable mask of controlled emotion. "Sister Margaret," she began, her voice measured and cold, "you followed our protocols. You obeyed our sacred rules. No one can fault you for that." But Margaret heard the unspoken words hanging in the air. "Yet 2 people are dead. The Archdiocese has asked that you take a leave of contemplation," Mother Superior continued. "Time away from your duties to pray and reflect. They believe it would be best for everyone involved." It was not a suggestion. It was an exile wrapped in ecclesiastical language. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, unable to protest. That evening she packed the few possessions allowed her, a change of habit, her rosary, a small wooden cross her mother had given her when she took her vows. As she placed them in a worn canvas bag, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The face staring back was a stranger, hollow-eyed, haunted, lost. The convent provided her with a small room in a retreat house 30 miles away, an isolated place in the mountains where sisters went to recover from illness or crisis of faith. Margaret arrived on a grey afternoon, the building looming against clouded skies like a question mark carved from stone. An elderly nun named Sister Beatrice greeted her at the door, her eyes kind but knowing. "You are not the first to come here with ghosts," she said simply, "and you will not be the last." The first week passed in a blur of mechanical routine. Margaret woke, prayed, ate, worked in the garden, prayed again, slept. But the prayers felt hollow, the words meaningless syllables that dissolved before reaching heaven. At night she dreamed of knocking, endless, desperate knocking that never stopped. And when she woke, gasping in the darkness, she could hear it still. Or perhaps it was her own heartbeat, pounding out an accusation she could not escape. On the 8th day, Sister Beatrice found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in soil, even though nothing was planted there. The old nun sat beside her without speaking for several minutes. Then softly she asked, "What are you digging for?" "Absolution," Margaret whispered, "but I cannot find it anywhere." Beatrice nodded slowly, her weathered face gentle. "Because you are looking in the wrong place, child. You are digging in the earth when what you seek is written on your own heart." That night, unable to sleep, Margaret left her room and wandered the retreat house corridors. She found herself in the small library, surrounded by books no one had touched in years. Running her fingers along the spines, she pulled one out randomly. It was a collection of letters from saints and mystics, their pages yellowed with age. She opened it to a marked passage, and the words seemed to leap off the page. Saint Teresa of Avila had written, "Christ has no body now on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Christ's compassion is to look out to the world. Yours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. Yours are the hands with which he is to bless now." Margaret read those words over and over, until they blurred with her tears. She thought of her hands, those hands that had scrubbed floors for 23 years, hands that had counted rosary beads and folded altar linens, and never, not once, opened a door to a dying child. What use were holy hands if they could not reach for suffering? What value was sacred space if it excluded the very people Christ had died for? The next morning, Margaret did something she had not done in over 2 decades. She left without permission. She walked down the mountain road in her habit, her small bag over her shoulder with no destination except away. She walked for hours, her feet blistering inside her worn shoes, until she reached a small town. There in a public library, she found what she was looking for: records, information, the truth about Diana Orozco. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with suspicious eyes, watched as Margaret searched through old newspapers on microfiche. "What are you looking for, sister?" "A life," Margaret replied, "a life I failed to save." Through meticulous research, Margaret pieced together Diana's story. She had been a nursing student, top of her class, engaged to be married. Diana Maria Orozco, the record said. Born in a small town 2 hours south, daughter of Clara and Roberto Orozco, both deceased, now save for Clara, who Margaret would later meet. Diana had scored in the 98th percentile on her nursing boards. She volunteered at free clinics on weekends. Her professors described her as gifted, compassionate, destined for greatness in a field that desperately needed people like her. Then everything shattered. Her fiancé, Thomas Brennan, died when a drunk driver ran a red light on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Diana was supposed to meet him for lunch. She was running late. She arrived at the intersection to find emergency vehicles and a body covered by a yellow tarp. Something fundamental broke inside her that day. The nursing professors noticed it first. She stopped attending lectures. Her hands, once so steady, trembled when handling medical equipment. She would start crying in the middle of practical exams for reasons she could not explain. She dropped out 3 months before graduation, lost her student apartment when she could not pay rent. Her mother begged her to come home, but Diana refused, ashamed of her failure, unable to face the disappointment in Clara's eyes. She drifted through the city like a ghost, taking odd jobs that lasted days or weeks before she would stop showing up. She slept in her car until it was repossessed. Then she slept in shelters, parks, anywhere that offered temporary refuge from a world that had become unbearably sharp and cruel. Sophie was born 2 years after Thomas's death. Diana never spoke about the father, not even to the nurses at the charity hospital where she delivered. But when they placed that tiny baby in her arms, something rekindled. Not healing, exactly, but purpose. A reason to keep breathing when breathing felt like punishment. For 18 months, Diana fought with fierce determination to give her daughter a life better than their circumstances. She stayed sober. She kept Sophie clean and fed, even when it meant Diana went hungry. She sang to her daughter every night, lullabies in Spanish that her own mother had once sung to her. They survived on the kindness of strangers and the inadequate safety net of a system stretched too thin. A church basement here, a friend's couch there, a shelter bed when one was available. But shelters have rules and time limits and waiting lists that stretch longer than hope. When the main family shelter closed due to budget cuts, Diana found herself with nowhere to turn. She tried every resource, knocked on every door, called every hotline. But it was December, the coldest winter in 30 years, and every place was full. Every place had reasons why they could not help. Valid reasons. Good reasons. Reasons that felt like death sentences. Margaret found Diana's old roommate from nursing school, a woman named Jennifer Larkin, who worked now as a pediatric nurse at the same hospital where Diana had done her clinical rotations. Jennifer cried when she heard what had happened, mascara running down her face in black rivers. Diana was brilliant, she said, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. She had this gift, you know. She could calm the most difficult patients. Kids loved her. Old people trusted her. She saw people, really saw them, in a way most medical professionals never manage. She wanted to help people so badly it was like a physical need. Jennifer pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photos with trembling fingers. Look, this was her at our graduation party. She did not actually graduate, but we threw her a party anyway. See that smile? That was before Thomas died, before everything fell apart. After the accident, she just could not function. Grief does not care about potential or promise. It just devours. Margaret stared at the photo. Diana laughing, her arm around Jennifer, both of them young and full of futures that would never arrive. And there, in the corner of the frame, a poster on the wall behind them. Choose compassion. The irony tasted like broken glass. What kind of person was she? Margaret asked, needing to know, needing to understand the woman she had condemned with her silence. Jennifer looked at her directly, her eyes red but fierce, the kind who would give her last dollar to a homeless person, even when she was homeless herself. The kind who cried at sad commercials and rescued injured birds and believed, truly believed, that the world could be good if people just tried harder to love each other. After Thomas died, after she lost everything, she blamed herself. Said she should have been on time. Said God was punishing her. But she never stopped loving. Even when it destroyed her, she never stopped trying to be good. And I did nothing, Margaret whispered, the words ashes in her mouth. Jennifer leaned forward, her voice dropping to something between anger and understanding. No, sister, you did something. You closed a door, you followed your rules while a woman and a child froze to death 3 blocks away. Now the question is not what you did. We both know what you did. The question is, what will you do next? Will you hide behind more rules and prayers? Or will you actually do something that matters? The words landed like physical blows. Margaret sat there, absorbing them, letting them carve new shapes into her understanding of sin and redemption. She had spent 23 years believing that holiness meant separation from the world's chaos. Now she understood that holiness meant exactly the opposite. It meant diving into that chaos with your hands open and your heart breaking, and no guarantee of anything except that it would cost you everything you thought you knew about being good. That night, Margaret did not return to the retreat house. Instead, she found a homeless shelter in the town, a cramped building that smelled of unwashed bodies and desperation. She told the director she wanted to volunteer. The woman looked at her habit with skepticism. We don't need prayers here, sister. We need hands. Then I will give you my hands, Margaret replied. She worked through that night, serving food, handing out blankets, listening to stories of loss and survival, a teenage mother fleeing an abusive boyfriend, an elderly man who lost his pension to a scam, a veteran whose nightmares made him unemployable. Each face was Diana. Each voice was that desperate knocking she had ignored. And with each person she helped, however small the gesture, she felt something begin to shift inside her. Not absolution, not peace, but perhaps the beginning of something like purpose. Days turned to weeks. Margaret did not return to the convent or the retreat house. She wrote a letter to Mother Superior, brief and honest. I cannot come back. I do not know if I will ever take communion again. But I know now that rules without mercy are just walls, and walls were meant to be torn down. She did not know if the letter would be understood or forgiven. She suspected it would not. The shelter director, a fierce woman named Patricia who wore exhaustion like armor, eventually took Margaret aside. "You are not like the other church people who come here," she said. "They pray and leave, you stay." "Why? Because I have a debt," Margaret answered, "and I do not think I will ever finish paying it." One evening, 2 months after leaving the retreat house, Margaret was organizing donated clothes when a young woman approached her. The woman held a small child, maybe 4 years old, bundled in a too large coat. The woman's eyes were haunted, her face gaunt with hunger or fear or both. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "They told me you might be able to help. I need somewhere to stay, just for a few nights, until I can figure things out." Margaret looked at the child, at those wide eyes staring up at her with absolute trust, and felt her heart constrict. For a moment, she was back at that door, hearing the knocking, feeling the weight of sacred rules pressing down like stones. Then she reached out and took the woman's cold hand in her own. "Yes," she said simply, "come with me. You are welcome here." That night, after helping the woman and child settle into a bed, after making sure they had food and warmth and safety, Margaret sat in the shelter's small chapel. It was nothing like the grand sanctuary of St. Agnes, just a room with a cross on the wall and a few folding chairs. But as she knelt there in the silence, she felt something she had not felt in months. Not peace, exactly. Not forgiveness, but maybe the smallest seed of it. The beginning of a long journey back toward whatever faith looked like on the other side of failure. She thought of Diana and Sophie, frozen and alone. She thought of all the doors in the world that remained closed to suffering, and she made a vow in that humble space. A vow that tasted like truth and terror and something almost like redemption. She would spend the rest of her life opening doors, every single one she could find, not because it would erase what she had done. Nothing could erase that, but because mercy, real mercy, was not an idea or a rule or a protocol. It was a choice made again and again, in the cold and the darkness, when no one was watching and nothing was easy. The seasons changed. Winter melted into spring. The shelter stayed full, an endless tide of people searching for grace in a world that offered so little. Margaret worked from dawn until long past midnight, her hands cracked and bleeding, her body exhausted, her spirit stretched thin as wire. But she did not stop. Could not stop. Patricia watched her with something between admiration and concern. "You are going to burn out," she warned one evening. "You cannot save everyone." Margaret looked up from the meal she was preparing, her face lined with new wrinkles that had nothing to do with age. "I know," she replied quietly, "but I can try. I have to try." News of the nun who left the convent to work with the homeless eventually reached the local press. A young reporter came to interview her, his recorder out, questions prepared. "Why did you leave the church?" he asked. "Was it because of guilt over those deaths?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I did not leave the church," she finally said. "I left the walls. Christ never lived in walls. He lived in the streets, among the broken and the forgotten. It took me 51 years to understand that." The interview was published in the city newspaper. It sparked debate and controversy. Some praised her courage, others condemned her abandonment of vows. The Archdiocese released a statement noting that Sister Margaret had voluntarily left her religious order, and her views did not represent official church teaching. Mother Superior sent no message at all, but Margaret found she did not need their approval anymore. The only judgment that mattered was the one rendered each night when she closed her eyes and faced the ghosts of her failures. 1 year after Diana and Sophie's deaths, Margaret organized a memorial service at the shelter. Not in a church, not behind sacred walls, but in the street outside the building where anyone could attend. Dozens came. Homeless individuals who had never met Diana but knew her story. Social workers and advocates. Even Detective Caldwell, who stood in the back with his hands in his pockets and something like respect in his eyes. Margaret spoke briefly, her voice carrying in the cold air. Diana Orozco was 26 years old when she died. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman who dreamed of healing others. Sophie was 3. She loved stories about birds. They died alone in the cold while I stood behind a locked door. I cannot change that. I can never change that. But I can choose every day to open the doors I am able to open, to see the sacred not in rules and walls, but in the faces of those who suffer. That is my penance. That is my prayer. That is the only faith I have left." The crowd was silent. Then, one by one, people began to speak, sharing stories of times they were turned away, times they were seen, times they survived, because someone chose mercy over protocol. The testimony went on for over an hour, a litany of grace and failure, hope and desperation, and when it ended, Patricia lit a candle, then another. Soon the street was filled with flickering light, small flames defying the darkness. Margaret stood among them, her face wet with tears, and for the first time since that terrible night, she felt something like forgiveness begin to take root. Not from God, not from the church, but from the community of broken people surrounding her, each one a mirror reflecting her own fractures, each one proof that redemption was not about perfection. It was about showing up again and again, even when every door in your life had been slammed shut. The shelter expanded over the following year. With donations and grants and sheer stubborn will, Patricia and Margaret secured a larger building. They added beds, hired staff, created programs for job training and mental health support. Margaret learned new skills: how to navigate bureaucracy, how to advocate for policy changes, how to fight systems that treated poverty as a moral failure rather than a structural crisis. Her hands, once soft from decades of ritual, grew strong from different kinds of labor: building, repairing, holding. On the second anniversary of Diana's death, Margaret received an unexpected visitor at the shelter, an older woman with silver hair and Diana's eyes. She introduced herself as Clara Orozco, Diana's mother. They had been estranged for years, she explained, tears streaming down her face. She only learned of her daughter's death 6 months ago through a cousin who saw a news article. Margaret led her to the small memorial they had created, photos of Diana and Sophie that Detective Caldwell had provided, flowers that visitors left, a small plaque with their names and dates. Clara collapsed to her knees before it, her grief so raw and total that Margaret could only kneel beside her and hold her while she shook. When Clara could finally speak, she looked at Margaret with eyes full of complicated pain. "You were the nun, the one who did not let them in." Margaret did not look away. "Yes, I am the one who failed them." Clara was silent for a long time. Then, quietly, she said something that Margaret would carry forever. Diana made many bad choices in her life. She hurt me. She hurt herself. But she loved Sophie with everything she had, and in those last hours she was trying. She was knocking on doors, begging for help. She was fighting for her daughter. There was nothing else she could have done. "And I could have done everything," Margaret whispered, "but I did nothing." Clara took Margaret's scarred hands in her own. "No, you did something unforgivable, and then you spent every day since trying to make it right. That does not erase what happened. But it means something. It has to mean something." They sat together until the sun set, two women bound by grief and guilt, and a fragile understanding that some wounds never fully heal. They just become part of who you are. Before Clara left, she hugged Margaret tightly. "Diana would have liked what you were doing here," she said. "She always wanted to help people. You are doing it for her now." After Clara left, Margaret returned to work. There was dinner to prepare, beds to make, 1,000 small tasks that kept the shelter running. But as she moved through those familiar routines, she felt something shift. Not peace, not absolution, but perhaps a kind of reconciliation with the impossibility of ever being fully redeemed. Perhaps faith was not about perfection or holy certainty. Perhaps it was about stumbling forward in the darkness, hands outstretched, hoping that every door you opened mattered, hoping that mercy, however late, however insufficient, was still worth offering. Years passed. The shelter became a fixture in the community, a place where people knew they could find warmth and dignity without judgment. Margaret aged, her hair graying, her body slowing, but her commitment never wavering. She lived simply in a small room at the shelter, her few possessions the same ones she had packed when leaving the convent, the wooden cross from her mother, the rosary beads she no longer prayed with, and a worn photograph of Diana and Sophie that Detective Caldwell had given her, kept beside her bed as a reminder of the cost of closed doors. On her 60th birthday, Patricia surprised her with a small celebration. Shelter residents past and present gathered, sharing cake and stories. A teenage mother Margaret had helped 5 years ago, now in nursing school, stood and spoke. "You saved my life," she said simply. "When I had nowhere to go, you opened the door. You saw me when I was invisible." Margaret listened to testimony after testimony, each person describing moments when a door opened, when mercy triumphed over protocol, when someone chose to see their humanity. And she realized that while she could never undo what she had failed to do for Diana and Sophie, she had somehow, impossibly, found a way to live with that failure. Not by forgetting, not by forgiving herself, but by transforming that terrible night into a commitment that shaped every subsequent day. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret did something she had not done in 7 years. She picked up her rosary beads. She did not pray the formal prayers of her youth. Instead, she simply held the beads and spoke to whatever presence might be listening. "I do not know if you are there," she whispered into the darkness. "I do not know if you hear me. I am not even sure I believe in you anymore. But if you are real, if grace is real, then let every door I open be a prayer. Let every person I help be a hymn. Let my whole broken life be an offering for the 2 I could not save." The beads were smooth against her fingers, worn from decades of devotion. And though no voice answered, though the room remained silent and empty, Margaret felt a strange sensation wash over her. Not divine certainty, not holy reassurance, but something quieter. The sense that perhaps faith was not about certainty at all. Perhaps it was about continuing to reach for goodness, even when you had failed catastrophically. About choosing mercy, even when you had once chosen its opposite. About opening doors precisely because you knew the cost of keeping them closed. She thought of Diana, freezing beneath an overpass, and Sophie, dying on convent steps. She thought of Clara, carrying grief that would never fully heal. She thought of all the people who had passed through the shelter's doors, each one carrying their own wounds, their own stories of systems that failed them, doors that closed in their faces. And she understood, finally, that her crisis of faith had not destroyed her belief. It had transformed it into something rawer, truer, infinitely more costly. Faith was not comfort. It was the agony of knowing you would fail and choosing to try anyway. It was opening your hands, even when they trembled. It was staying present to suffering even when it shattered you. It was building something redemptive from the ruins of your worst mistakes, knowing that redemption would always be incomplete, insufficient, agonizingly partial, but also knowing that partial mercy was better than perfect rules, and that the smallest act of grace could mean the difference between death and survival, despair and hope, a closed door and an open one. Margaret set down the rosary and looked at the photograph beside her bed. Diana's face young and frightened, Sophie's small hand clutching her mother's sleeve. "I am sorry," she whispered to them, as she did every night. "I will spend the rest of my life being sorry, but I will also spend it making sure that what happened to you does not happen to anyone else I can reach. That is all I have to offer. My broken self, my open doors, my refusal to ever again choose sacred rules over sacred lives." The next morning arrived with pale sunlight and the familiar sounds of the shelter waking. Footsteps in hallways, quiet conversations, the smell of coffee, and something baking in the kitchen. Margaret rose, dressed, and went to work. There were people to feed, children to comfort, systems to fight, doors to open. Her faith, such as it was, looked nothing like the certainty she had once known. It was messy and scarred and shot through with doubt, but it was hers, earned in fire and failure, built from the ashes of everything she thought she knew about holiness and grace. And as she opened the shelter door that morning, to let in the cold and the needy and the desperate, as she said welcome to a stranger seeking warmth, she felt it again. That small seed of redemption, not granted from above but grown from below, from the dirt and the struggle and the daily choice to show up. It would never be enough. She would carry Diana and Sophie with her until her dying day. But it was something. In a world of closed doors and sacred rules that protected nothing but themselves, it was something. She had failed. She would always be the nun who closed the door. But she was also the woman who spent every day since trying to open them all. And in that trying, in that endless imperfect effort, she had found not the faith she lost, but a faith that mattered more, a faith that cost everything, a faith that required not belief, but action, not prayers, but presence, not walls, but bridges built from the broken pieces of your own heart. The morning stretched ahead, full of need and possibility. Margaret stepped forward to meet it, her hands open, her door unlocked, her whole scarred self an offering to the world that rules had once kept at bay. And though she would never fully escape the ghost of that terrible night, she had learned to walk with it, to let it drive her forward rather than pull her down, to transform her greatest sin into her deepest purpose. The snow would fall again, winter would return. There would always be desperate people knocking on doors, begging for mercy, but this door, at least, would open, again and again, for as long as she had breath. That was her prayer now, that was her faith, not perfect, not pure, but real, and in the end, perhaps that was the only faith that ever truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives like this. Leave a like to support our work and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Your support helps us continue creating these meaningful stories. Until next time.